Hey, what's up? This is Scott with Level Up Tutorials, and in this video, we're going to be talking about the basics of CSS Grid. And we're going to get into it without diving into too much code, but looking at some visuals and maybe talking about how to think in Grid. Because really, when we get into Grid, thinking in Grid might be the most important part. So let's get started with that right now. Okay, so before we get into any code here, I want to talk a bit about CSS Grid and sort of what the terminology is overall. Because CSS Grid, although it is one of the most exciting new layout tools in CSS, it is very different than things that we've used before in the past, and even more different than Flexbox, which is already pretty different. So now where Flexbox, you dealt with things in a row, right? We had a row of things and we could choose how they displayed in that row, how they wrapped, how they filled the space. And it was primarily just a row, whether or not that row was vertical and a column or horizontal and a row, it was still just sort of a single direction, left, right, up, or down. Now with CSS Grid, we have the option of actually having layout in a matrix of space here. And as we can see, what I'm going to show you in these diagrams here is some sort of basic things that we need to go over before we start talking about the code. Now, what we have here is just a basic grid. And this can sort of function and work like any sort of other grid. I mean, you've used grids all over the place, even in things like Microsoft Excel, right? You have a 2D matrix of data. And you'll largely want to think about CSS Grid in the same way. And while these grid cells can be flexible, that's not necessarily the same type of layout system as Flexbox. Now, sure, we can make this layout that you see here with Flexbox, but that's not what this is about. So let's start talking a little bit about the terminology. As you can see, we have our basic grid. Nothing crazy, we have some items here. Now, let's talk about what each thing is here. I have some diagrams. So first, we have this purple line. And now, what does this purple line indicate? Well, it's what's called a grid line. So these are things that you're going to have to get used to with the terminology in Flexbox, because there is a lot of new properties and we're going to want to make sure we have all of them in our brain. And so sure enough, this is a line. It's a grid line. Now, what exactly does a grid line mean in the context of CSS Grid? Well, it's basically how the grid is divided. And these things come in flavors that are just vertical or horizontal. But what these grid lines do is they separate separate little sections of our grid. Now, what are these sections called? Well, these sections are called a grid cell. And so right here, we have an individual cell, just like here and here and here and here and here. So when we're placing things in our grid, and let's say we wanted our logo in the top right, well, we would put it inside of this grid cell. A grid cell is where your stuff is going to live, and the track is going to be the divider between the cells, okay? Again, I always kind of go back to Microsoft Excel when thinking about grids, or even tables if you're used to working in HTML tables. However, these are certainly no HTML table. So next we have a word that is a little bit more interesting, and this is grid track. Now a grid track, just like a grid line, is going to be, again, either horizontal or vertical. It's not going to be both. And you can see we have a vertical grid track. Now the vertical grid track here is the space in between two lines. So we have the first line, we have the second line, and here we have our grid track. Just like this track, we have another track which now spans the entire width of the horizontal area. Now keep in mind, because like I said, the grid track is the space between two grid lines, as in this one and this one, if we were to then say, hey, also make it between this one, well, that's not really a track anymore. In fact, it's going to be what the next item is, which is a grid area. However, what we want to note here is that a grid track always spans either the full width or the full height. These are all grid tracks. In fact, in this current example, how many grid tracks do you see? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So we have 6 grid tracks in this example. Okay, next we have a grid area, which is what I mentioned before. Now, the grid area, as you can see, it's basically the same thing as a track, but, well, it's spaced between both horizontal and vertical dimensions. Now, if this grid were larger, you would see that a grid area doesn't necessarily have to be at the edges or anything like that. If this extended up above and below here and to the right, this area could be smack in the middle of our grid and we would still have a grid area. So you could imagine if we had like a spreadsheet of information and you're going to select 4 cells, you would click and drag, and this is what a grid area is, okay? So this is nothing too crazy if you've worked in any sort of basic geometry or anything like that. We have a line, we have a cell, we have a track, and we have an area. Okay, so this is the basic CSS grid terminology out of the way. So I will have a diagram available for this as an image with the course files if you want to keep consulting back to it. However, this is definitely something you're just going to have in your brain so that when I say cell or track or line or anything like that, you can have a mental image of exactly what I'm talking about. Now, as we go on, you won't need an exact mental image because we're going to be using some dev tools that show you a physical image on top of your layout. However, for now, it's nice to stick to the basics. Okay, so in the next video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start working with CSS Grid, and if we need to, we can always come back to this image, but what we're going to be doing is talking about basic grid properties, just like with Flexbox. And while these aren't going to be super practical, it's going to be laying the groundwork so that when we start building our practical layouts, we know what the heck we're doing with these given properties, and we can start to make excellent layouts. So as always, this is Scott with Level Up Tutorials. I hope you learned a little bit more about CSS Grid, and in the next video, we're gonna get started actually typing up some grid code. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.